Murder at the Community Centre, a Miss Marple mystery. Dear listeners, welcome to tonight's Miss Marple mystery. I'm Frank, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you here for another captivating tale. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear a bit about you. What do you do? Or what did you do for a living? Maybe you're a chef, a gardener, an artist, or something wonderfully unique. Drop it in the comments. I always enjoy discovering more about our amazing community. Now let's get cozy and start tonight's story. Chapter 1. The sun slanted gently across the village green, casting long golden fingers over the bunting that fluttered in the breeze. It was the sort of afternoon St. Aldhelm's rarely forgot to admire, calm, content, and deceptively ordinary. The St. Mary Mead Community Centre, a modest brick building with ivy curling around its front windows, stood at the heart of the excitement. Its doors were flung open, spilling out laughter, the tinkling of teacups, and the clatter of folding chairs. Today was the annual charity rummage sale and garden tea. Inside, Mrs. Bantry had just managed to elbow her way toward a display of antique silverware, muttering something about Colonel Luscombe's widow having no idea of proper polish. Meanwhile, Reverend Copley stood near the raffle table, trying to diplomatically avoid Mrs. Merriweather's persistent campaign to have her corgi featured in the church bulletin. At a side table near the window, a young girl scribbled names in the auction ledger, while her mother, Mrs. Marchmont, loudly explained the rules of silent bidding to no one in particular. And quietly, unassumingly, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea. She sat near the French doors that opened into the garden, a neutral outpost from which she could observe the afternoon's various dramas. Her pale blue gloves, folded neatly beside her plate, were as unruffled as her expression. Her eyes, however, moved constantly, though gently, like the nodding head of a daisy in wind. She sipped, listened, and noted everything. It was at such events, she knew, that village life pulled back its lace curtains and revealed glimpses of what truly lay beneath. And though today's occasion was cheerful on the surface, she had already caught the edges of something darker, tensions running like tiny cracks through porcelain. She'd seen the hesitation in Alice Renfrew's smile as she'd greeted Miss Cavendish, heard the silence between Dr. Barrow and his wife when they passed the cake table, noted that young Mr. Eversley, the piano teacher, had arrived with his usual swagger, but now sat unusually quiet near the coat rack, sipping lukewarm tea and darting glances towards the back room. You see, Miss Marple had once told her nephew Raymond, people think it's the murder that surprises me, but it never does. What surprises me is how many people believe a village is a peaceful place. Just then the piano in the corner struck a jarring chord. The sound was meant to be celebratory, a short performance by the local children's choir, but something had gone wrong with the tuning, or perhaps the performer's nerves. The sound made everyone look up. Everyone, that is, except Miss Marple. She was already watching someone else. Mr. Leonard Leach, the community centre's acting director, stood at the refreshment table with a fixed smile and sweat glistening beneath his collar. His eyes were scanning the room, not with interest but with caution. He nodded to a few villagers and raised a cup in toast, but no one raised theirs in return. A little too forced, Miss Marple thought. A little too careful. He does look a bit strained, doesn't he? Murmured Mrs. Bantry, who had settled beside her with a scone piled high with clotted cream. Not that I blame him. Half the parish thinks he pocketed funds from the expansion budget, though no one says so out loud. Miss Marple smiled gently. No one ever does, my dear. but it's always fascinating what people will imply. Still, he's quite charming. In that nervous way, Mrs. Bantry continued, though I dare say Mr. Leach is keeping a few secrets under that slick hair of his. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Aren't we all? A soft crash sounded from the back corridor, the one that led to the utility rooms and the storage area. Silence followed, then footsteps. Probably just the wind, someone said, though the doors were closed. No one seemed eager to investigate. Miss Marple noted the way Mrs. Marchmont flinched, the way Mr. Eversley stood suddenly, then sat just as quickly, the way Alice Renfrew clasped her hands too tightly. By the time the choir began to sing again, this time in better tune, conversation had resumed, albeit with less enthusiasm. Something unseen had shifted. The warmth of the room no longer felt comforting, but close. As the event drew to a close and people began to leave with empty pie dishes and fading chatter, Miss Marple remained a moment longer in her seat by the French doors. She gazed across the room, taking in the last slant of sunlight falling across the parquet floor. The raffled items were mostly gone, the silverware untouched, the storage room door now slightly ajar. Just then Mrs. Merriweather approached. "Oh, Miss Marple, wasn't it a lovely afternoon? Everything went off so smoothly." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, almost too smoothly, I'd say." She rose slowly, gathering her gloves and handbag. "Do forgive an old woman's habit of worrying," she added, almost to herself, "but I do wonder what really fell in that back room." Because later that night, when the centre's cleaning woman unlocked the door to the storage corridor, she would find Leonard Leach face down near the shelving unit. The shelves, overstacked with rummage items, had supposedly fallen, but the bruise behind his ear would tell a different story. And so, in the stillness of a few, Sunday evening, St. Mary Mead's peace shattered, quietly, as always. Miss Marple was already polishing her spectacles. Chapter 2. The morning after the charity event, a hush lingered over St. Mary Mead, not the peaceful kind, but one stretched thin with unspoken questions. The community centre stood cordoned off with a thin strip of yellow police tape, incongruous against its red-bricked charm. A constable, barely out of school by the look of him, stood near the gate with a clipboard and shifting eyes, clearly unused to death, wrapped in doilies and social niceties. Inside, the echo of boots on varnished floorboards marked the arrival of Inspector Crail from Much Benham. He was a lean man with a tightly trimmed moustache, whose patience had long since been worn smooth by small-town evasions and overlapping alibis. He surveyed the scene in the storage corridor with a clinical eye. Leonard Leach's body had already been removed, but the outline of the shelving unit, now upright again, was visible in the scuff marks across the waxed floor. A patch of blood had stained the edge of a small rug that didn't quite belong there, oddly folded at one corner. "Unfortunate accident," said the constable, nervously clearing his throat. "Tripped perhaps while reorganizing." Crail squatted beside the base of the shelving. "With a contusion that clean behind the ear? I think not." Outside, news had already fluttered through the village like washing on a windy line. At the High Street's grocer, Mrs. Cardew whispered over apples to her neighbour. "Terrible thing, fell, they say, but Leonard was such a nimble sort, wasn't he?" At the post office, Mr. Taylor leaned forward conspiratorially. "Odd timing, if you ask me. Right after he made that fuss about the community funds." By noon, everyone in St. Mary Mead knew someone who had seen something, though none could agree on what. Meanwhile, at the vicarage, Miss Marple stirred a second spoonful of honey into her tea. politely refusing the offer of sponge cake from Mrs. Copley. The vicar sat nearby, clasping his hands with quiet discomfort. "It's almost distressing," he said, eyes troubled. "Leonard wasn't universally liked, of course, but still, he didn't deserve such an end." "No one ever does," said Miss Marple softly. She turned her gaze to the lace-curtained window, where the church steeple stood against a cloudy sky. "I wonder, Reverend, had Leonard seemed uneasy to you recently? Distracted, perhaps?" "He always seemed tense, truth be told," he replied, "especially since the council meeting last month. There was talk of money gone missing, and Leonard did not take kindly to accusation. He was trying to push through that youth outreach extension, remember?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, nodding. "Quite modern of him. And not everyone in the village likes change." "Indeed," muttered the vicar. "And then there was that unfortunate business with Mrs. Cavendish and the piano teacher. You know how quickly gossip stirs." Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward him, calm but attentive. "And what business was that?" "Oh, nothing one could prove," he said quickly. "Just a bit of unpleasantness. Accusations, improprieties. Leonard tried to smooth things over, but, well, certain tempers were frayed." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "It does seem," she murmured, "that Leonard Leach had become a very inconvenient man." Later that afternoon, Inspector Crail knocked firmly at the door of Marchmont House, where Mrs. Marchmont answered with her usual tight-lipped efficiency and barely veiled impatience. "Of course I remember the charity event," she said crisply. "Why wouldn't I? A perfectly successful afternoon. And yes, I saw Leonard, briefly. He seemed preoccupied, but then he often was. Always something about scheduling conflicts or plumbing repairs." Crail stepped inside, eyeing the hallway's lined photographs and brass umbrella stand. "May I ask where you were at the time of the incident?" Mrs. Marchmont folded her arms. "I was overseeing the final count of the raffle entries. Young Sarah Fletcher was with me, taking notes. You're welcome to ask her. We didn't hear anything unusual." "Did you see anyone leave the main room around that time?" "Half the village was drifting in and out. But if you're implying I had something to do with that man's death, Inspector, I'd remind you that Leonard and I had a perfectly civil working relationship." Crail inclined his head slightly. "Of course." But as he stepped outside, he jotted down a single note. "Too polished, watch her." Elsewhere, Miss Marple had chosen a less direct route, calling on Miss Cavendish, who lived in a small white cottage with rose vines tangled across the front gate. She was a woman in her late 40s, always vaguely anxious and inclined to weeping when things went awry. "I don't know what to say, Miss Marple," she said, ushering her in. "It's all such a shock. Poor Leonard. He could be difficult, but he meant well. Always fluttering about with his clipboard." Miss Marple accepted the offered tea. "And were things quite peaceful with the community centre committee? No quarrels?" Miss Cavendish hesitated. "Oh, no, not quarrels exactly, but there were strains. Alice Renfrew was furious over the cancelled flower arranging course. Mr. Eversley kept arguing over rehearsal schedules. And then, of course, Leonard had words with the Barrows." Miss Marple glanced up. "The Barrows? Yes, about the funding requests for the nursery renovations. Dr. Barrows said Leonard rejected their application quite abruptly. Claimed the paperwork was incomplete, but I suspect it was more personal." "Personal?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Miss Cavendish glanced down at her lap. There were rumours about Mrs. Barrow and Leonard. "I see." Miss Marple's voice was light, but her eyes sharpened. "And do you believe there was any truth to them?" Miss Cavendish hesitated, then shrugged helplessly. I don't know, but she always blushed when he was around. As Miss Marple left the cottage, the sky had darkened slightly, and the clouds hung heavier over the village roofs. It had begun, she thought, not the investigation, but the unravelling. Secrets, when pressed by silence and fear, had a habit of surfacing slowly, like damp through wallpaper. And in St. Mary Mead, the wallpaper was starting to peel. Chapter 3. Inspector Crail arrived at the Laurels just after midday, his overcoat still damp from the morning drizzle. The house, owned by Dr. Richard Barrow and his wife Elaine, sat neatly behind trimmed hedges and a wrought-iron gate, its red door freshly painted. A touch of control in an otherwise fraying situation. Mrs. Barrow opened the door with practised poise, but there was a tension in her posture, a slight tightness around the eyes that didn't quite match her polite smile. "Inspector Crail, was it? Please, do come in." Crail stepped into the hallway, noting the faint scent of lavender polish, the symmetrical frames lining the wall, and a well-thumbed copy of Modern Gardening on the side table. The house looked immaculate, but somehow overmanaged. Dr. Barrow joined them a moment later, tall and fair, his manner clipped. "We've already heard the news, Inspector," he said. "Terrible business. If there's anything we can do to assist—" "You were both at the charity event yesterday?" Crail asked. "Certainly," said Dr. Barrow. "Elaine helped with the silent auction. I was managing the first aid station, such as it was." Mrs. Barrow's hand fluttered to her necklace, a small silver cross. "Richard didn't leave the main hall once, did you, darling?" "Not for more than a minute or two," he said, "to fetch supplies from the car." Crail nodded slowly. "And what was your relationship with Mr. Leach?" Dr. Barrow's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone level. "Professional. We worked together on a few centre programmes. He was competent, if a little self-important." Elaine's smile faltered. "I wouldn't say we were close." Crail watched her a beat longer. "There were rumours, Mrs. Barrow." Her eyes flashed. "Barely. People talk." He let the silence hang for a moment longer, before making a few notes and taking his leave. Down the lane, Miss Marple walked with Mrs. Bantry along a path hedged in dog roses and the last of the season's lavender. The air smelled of wet leaves and something else. Restlessness. "I still say it was an accident," Mrs. Bantry insisted. "That shelving in the back room was never stable. I told them last year during the coat drive. A sneeze would have knocked it down." Miss Marple nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. "Do you recall the timing of the raffle draw yesterday?" Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Right before the choir sang, I think. Just after the crash in the back room. Why?" "No reason, dear," said Miss Marple mildly. "Only I find it curious that no one seems to remember precisely who left the main room and when. Isn't it strange how vague everyone becomes when a little chaos enters the scene?" Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Well, yes, but it was just a bit of a tumble, wasn't it? I dare say everyone thought it was nothing." "Indeed, and yet Leonard Leach ended up quite dead." They walked a while in silence, until Mrs. Bantry added, "You're not thinking this is murder, are you?" Miss Marple's response was as gentle as a breeze. "I'm thinking people don't die of falling shelves unless they're alone when they fall. And Leonard Leach, you'll remember, was not a man who did much quietly or unnoticed." Later that afternoon, Inspector Crail returned to the community centre, this time accompanied by Constable Bell. The storage corridor had been cleared, but something about it still felt wrong. The rug, the shelving, the odd placement of a cracked clipboard beneath the lowest shelf. Crail crouched. "See this," he said. "If the shelf collapsed forward, the clipboard should be under it, or shattered, but it's just cracked." Belle squinted. "So it was placed there afterward? Or during?" He straightened and turned to the supply cupboard just across the corridor. It was locked. Belle produced a keyring. Inside, rows of neatly labelled plastic bins, paintbrushes, glue sticks, disinfectant. And tucked between the mop buckets, a pair of men's leather gloves. One had a reddish smear on the thumb. Crail nodded. "Bag them." Back in the village, Miss Marple paid a visit to the grocer, ostensibly for preserves, but mostly for the company. Behind the counter, Mr. Archibald Rowe sorted receipts with one hand and restocked the biscuit tins with the other. "Awful about Leonard," he said with a shake of his head. "Though I can't say I'm shocked. Man had too many fingers in too many pies. Always seemed to know a bit too much about everyone's business." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, you mean he was a gossip?" No, Rose said quickly. "He listened more than he spoke. And people told him things, without meaning to, I expect. Had that way about him. He'd ask about your tomatoes, and before you knew it, you'd confessed to cheating at bridge. I suppose that sort of man collects secrets like other people collect stamps." Rowe chuckled. "Quite right." As she left, Miss Marple passed by the piano teacher, Mr. Eversley, who stood outside the post office, chewing his lip and glancing nervously toward the centre down the road. "Good afternoon, Mr. Eversley," she said pleasantly. He jumped. "Miss Marple, yes, good afternoon. You must be very busy with lessons these days." He shrugged. "It's a quiet season. Many pupils away for holidays." She tilted her head. "I imagine Leonard Leach kept you quite busy with event coordination." Eversley's face froze. "Not particularly. He didn't think much of the arts program." And yet, I heard he defended your position when the budget was under review." Mr. Eversley's mouth opened, then shut. He looked at the pavement. "Well, yes, he did." Miss Marple smiled. "Curious, isn't it? The people who help us when we don't expect it." She turned and left, leaving Eversley staring after her. That night, as the village lights flickered off one by one, a letter was slipped through the door of the police station. No name, no return address. Inside, one line written in a shaky, anonymous hand. He knew about the Barrow file. That's why he had to be silenced. The mystery had only just begun. Chapter 4. The anonymous note shifted everything. Inspector Crail arrived early the next morning at the station, the paper sealed inside an evidence sleeve. He held it like a nettle, irritating but impossible to ignore. Constable Bell hovered near the desk, waiting for direction. "No fingerprints," Bell said. "Whoever wrote this wore gloves." Crail glanced toward the window. Grey dawn filtered through, cold and dull. Someone wanted us pointed toward the Barrows, but not openly. "Could be a plant, sir." "It could," Crail murmured, "which is precisely why we follow it." He pocketed the note. At the same time, across the village, Miss Marple sat before her hearth with her knitting basket. Pale blue wool rested in her lap, though the needles moved more slowly than usual. Her mind wasn't on knitting. It seldom was, when cruelty had slunk into St. Mary Mead like a fox through a henhouse. Leonard Leach had secrets. That much was clear in the social tremors rippling through the village. People were suddenly careful with sentences, careful with who saw them speaking to whom. Fear was not yet loud, but it was growing roots. Miss Marple always paid attention to roots. A knock came at her door. Alice Renfrew awaited outside, pale, hat skewed, hands clutched together so tightly the knuckles were white. "May I come in, please?" Miss Marple stepped aside. Alice sank onto the small sofa near the window. "I can't stay long, they'll see me." Miss Marple did not ask who they were. She poured tea instead. "Did you know Leonard was planning to step down?" Alice whispered. "He'd been threatened. He didn't say who. Only that some people wouldn't tolerate the changes he wanted at the centre. He said he had proof. Files, records." Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the mantel clock. "And where are these files now, my dear?" Alice swallowed. I don't know, but he mentioned the Barrows. That's why I came. You see, Leonard thought Dr. Barrow had falsified receipts on the expansion project last spring. Did he confront him? He meant to. Yesterday, before the sale was over. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Alice trembled, not from nerves alone, from fear of someone else. "And you believe this had something to do with his death?" Alice's voice broke. "Yes." Miss Marple set her cup down. "Then tell Inspector Crail everything." Alice shook her head violently. "No, I can't. If I do, I'll be next." She stood, clutched her coat, and left as quickly as she'd arrived. At the Laurels, Crail faced the Barrows again, this time with the note in hand. Dr. Barrow bristled immediately. "This is absurd. An unsigned accusation. Anyone could have written that." Elaine stood very still, gaze fixed on the mantelpiece. Crail didn't raise his voice. "Where were you exactly when the shelves fell in the back corridor?" Elaine's pulse fluttered in her throat. "We were both in the main hall. I told you already." Crail looked at her, just long enough to make her shift. "That wasn't what I asked," he said softly. Dr. Barrow exhaled sharply. "Inspector, this is harassment." Crail slipped the note back into his pocket. "Until we know why Leonard Leach died, nothing is harassment. Everything is necessary." He left them in silence. Meanwhile, Miss Marple made a stop no one would have expected, Marchmont House. Inside, the drawing-room smelled of bergamot and freshly ironed linen. Mrs. Marchmont sat perfectly composed, reading correspondence. "Dear Miss Marple," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "how nice of you to call." Miss Marple glanced toward the desk where folders sat in organized stacks. Too many, all meticulously labeled. "You are still managing the centre accounts this month?" she asked lightly. Mrs. Marchmont adjusted a bracelet, temporarily, until the committee appoints a replacement. "And perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "you know what Leonard meant when he spoke of irregularities in the financials?" A flicker, barely a breath, passed across Mrs. Marchmont's face before she smoothed it away. "Leonard tended to exaggerate," she replied. "He was very fond of drama." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Then you won't mind if Inspector Crail reviews the account ledgers?" Mrs. Marchmont's teacup rattled faintly against the saucer. "I don't see why that would be necessary." Miss Marple rose. "Oh, it may not be, but do remember, dear, sometimes the smallest number out of place tells the largest story." She left before Mrs. Marchmont could respond. That evening, Miss Marple walked the green alone. The wind had picked up, carrying dead leaves in swirling circles. She paused by the notice board where flyers for events fluttered. One corner of a paper had come loose. She pinned it back, then noticed a torn scrap caught beneath thumbtack. "Community Centre, storage inventory access. Key must remain in office drawer." Someone had not followed that rule. She studied the lone scrap, then the direction of the wind, then the windows glowing inside the centre. The truth was widening now. Somewhere, behind social politeness and tidy hedges, motive was stirring like poison before tea. And Miss Marple knew, quietly, calmly, that Leonard Leach had not been silenced by panic or impulse. Someone had thought it through, and someone was very afraid the past was about to resurface. Chapter 5. The next morning dawned dim and slate-grey, a hush laying thick over St. Mary Mead, as if the sky itself knew something was coming. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner of the post office, her gloved hands resting neatly on her lap. She wasn't buying stamps. She rarely did. But the post office, like most village crossroads, had an undercurrent of information, fluttering, half-formed, but potent. Mr. Taylor behind the counter was murmuring something to Sarah Fletcher, the Marchmont's assistant who had come to collect the centre's redirected mail. Her eyes darted, her voice hushed. Miss Marple waited until Sarah stepped outside, then followed at a modest distance, just enough to seem coincidental. At the turn of the lane, Sarah paused near the hedgerow, opening one of the envelopes she had gathered. Then, with a furtive glance, she slipped it into her coat pocket rather than the mailbag. "Good morning, Miss Fletcher," Miss Marple said lightly, stepping forward. Sarah jumped. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." "No reason you should," Miss Marple smiled, eyes kind. "I was merely admiring the chrysanthemums at the foot of the path. Splendid this year." Sarah nodded stiffly. "Working for Mrs. Marchmont must be rather demanding, I imagine." Sarah hesitated. She likes things precise. "Precision's admirable," Miss Marple agreed, "unless, of course, one is asked to misfile receipts or remove documents." Sarah's face paled. I wouldn't know anything about that." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "But if you did, dear, and someone knew you had, you'd be in rather a vulnerable position, wouldn't you?" Sarah blinked. "Do you think someone saw me?" Miss Marple gave no answer, only a knowing silence. Sarah clutched her bag tighter. "He said I didn't have a choice." "Leonard, no," she whispered. "Dr. Barrow." That afternoon, Inspector Crail was not in the mood for half-truths. He found Dr. Barrow pruning roses in his back garden, sleeves rolled, movements overly deliberate. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened between you and Leonard Leach last week," Crail said. Dr. Barrow didn't pause. "We disagreed. He accused me of misusing centre funds. It was ridiculous. I asked for full transparency. He refused. Refused or delayed." Barrow's secateurs clipped down on a stem too harshly. "It's easy to sling mud when you don't understand the paperwork. I'm a physician, not a bookkeeper. Yet your wife handled many of the centre's events. Did she ever mention Leonard's suspicions?" "No," Barrow said flatly. "And if she had, I'd have told her to ignore him." Crail studied him. "You went to your car during the charity event." "Yes, for bandages. But no one saw you return." Barrow turned. "Inspector, are you accusing me of murder?" "I'm stating facts," Crail replied. "And the facts say Leonard Leach was silenced. Someone made sure he wouldn't share whatever he knew." Barrow's eyes narrowed. "Then find them, but don't waste time in my garden." At her cottage, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Mr. Eversley stood at the gate, hat in hand, raincoat damp. He looked smaller somehow, his usual self-importance crumbling. "I need to talk to someone," he said, "and you listen." She ushered him in with a quiet nod. Inside, he didn't sit. He paced. "I heard you spoke to Miss Cavendish. About Leonard, about the choir." Miss Marple's expression was serene. "Yes." She seemed unsettled. "As do you." Eversley sighed. "Leonard knew something about me. About years ago, before I came here. It wasn't criminal, just unfortunate. I made a mistake with a student. Nothing happened. But the accusation nearly ruined me." "And Leonard found out?" "Yes. He said he had no intention of telling anyone, but he could be cruel with silence. He let you feel he knew." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And yet you didn't kill him." He looked up sharply. "No, I swear it. I avoided him as much as I could. That day I left the main hall briefly, yes, but only to get air, not to murder someone." She nodded, calm. "I believe you." Eversley blinked. "Why?" "Because you're afraid of being exposed," Miss Marple said gently. "Not of being caught." He left soon after, shoulders hunched. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned to her mantel where a list of names sat under a teacup. Mrs. Marchmont, Dr. Barrow, Alice Renfrew, Sarah Fletcher, Mr. Eversley. One name had not yet been scratched off. Elaine Barrow. At that very moment, Elaine was standing in her conservatory, fingers trembling around a china teacup. Across from her, Alice Renfrew sat very still. "You should not have spoken to her," Elaine said sharply. "You don't understand what you've started." "I'm not part of this," Alice said. I couldn't keep quiet." Elaine's eyes flashed. "You were part of it the moment you accepted that hush payment." Alice stood, stiff. "I'm going to the police." Elaine's expression changed in an instant. Tight lips, flicker of fear. "You do that," she said coldly. "Just be sure your own secrets stay buried." Alice fled without another word. Elaine turned to the window. Beyond the hedges, Miss Marple was walking by, her head slightly tilted as if she could hear the unspoken from the pavement. Elaine closed the curtains. In Miss Marple's mind, the threads were pulling tighter. The motives had surfaced: embezzlement, secrets, shame. Now it was only a matter of time before someone slipped. And in St. Mary Mead, slips always cost dearly. Chapter 6. The village awoke the next morning to more than mist and fallen leaves. Alice Renfrew was missing. Her neighbour, Mrs. Petrie, had knocked on her door to return a misplaced scarf, only to find the front gate ajar, the lights still burning in the hallway, and no answer inside. The police were summoned. By mid-morning, Inspector Crail was standing in Alice's neat kitchen, noting a cup of untouched tea, lipstick still fresh on the rim, and a coat missing from the hook by the door. Her handbag remained. Outside, Miss Marple stood quietly at the end of the lane, watching as uniformed officers moved in and out of the house. "She wouldn't have left without telling someone," Mrs. Petrie was saying nearby. Alice was many things, but rude she was not. Crail stepped out onto the path, scanning the growing cluster of neighbours. His eyes landed on Miss Marple. "She came to you, didn't she?" he asked without preamble. "Yes," Miss Marple answered evenly. "She was frightened, and I believe she had every reason to be." He nodded. "What did she say?" "That Leonard had uncovered financial misconduct. She suspected Dr. Barrow was involved, but she feared Mrs. Barrow." Crail looked surprised. "Elaine?" Miss Marple met his gaze. "There's a certain chill to her, don't you think? Not the loud type of malice, but the precise kind. Calculated, controlled." Crail didn't respond immediately. "Then we'll search the woods and speak to the Barrows again." But Miss Marple knew. If Alice Renfrew had gone to confront Elaine, and Elaine had something to hide, Alice wouldn't be found easily, or perhaps not alive. Meanwhile, Sarah Fletcher sat rigid behind Mrs. Marchmont's desk, sorting receipts with mechanical precision. Her eyes were rimmed red, her fingers trembling slightly. "I want everything from this year reviewed," Mrs. Marchmont said briskly, standing over her. "Don't miss a single item." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah murmured. Mrs. Marchmont turned away, but not before her eyes lingered a moment too long on the office drawer. As soon as she left, Sarah pulled the drawer open. The key to the storage room sat inside, still dusty, untouched. She reached for it, then pulled her hand back. Instead, she opened the bottom drawer, pulled out the unopened envelope from yesterday, the one she hadn't delivered. It bore no return address, only a shaky scrawl. He had proof. It's in the ledger, behind the old hymnals. Sarah blinked. Then she stood, slowly, deliberately. At the community centre, the wind rattled the windows as Sarah moved through the main hall, her coat drawn tight around her. No one was there. The centre had been closed pending the investigation. She should not have had access. But she'd kept a copy of the master key. She passed the trophy case, the coat stand, the piano, then slipped into the back corridor and unlocked the storage room. The smell of dust and old paper filled the air. She flicked on the light. Cardboard boxes, stacked chairs, folded linens. And in the far corner, a short wooden shelf, where hymnals were stacked in 2 rows. Sarah stepped closer, heart thudding. She reached behind the books. Her hand brushed a file folder. Suddenly, footsteps echoed behind her. She turned, a shadow filled the doorway. She didn't scream, just gasped. "You!" The light snapped off. Miss Marple wasn't one to linger indoors when her instincts stirred. She had not seen Sarah Fletcher all afternoon. The Marchmonts had claimed she'd gone home unwell. But there was a tightness in Mrs. Marchmont's tone, a trace of something rehearsed. Miss Marple, walking past the centre just after dusk, paused at the gate. A light had flickered earlier, very faint, barely noticeable. She looked at the small flower bed near the entrance. Fresh footprints, 1 pair, in and out, not police boots. She followed the path around to the back, keeping to the edge of the hedgerow. The storage room's outer door, typically kept locked, was ajar. Inside, the shadows were thick, and the air smelled faintly of something metallic. Miss Marple stepped inside. At first, she saw nothing. Then a hand, a sleeve. Sarah, unconscious on the floor, 1 temple bruised and bleeding, but still breathing. No documents in sight. Miss Marple bent down, fingers gentle at the wrist, steady pulse, shallow breath. She reached for the door and calmly called for help. The village reeled again. Another accident, another fall. Inspector Crail stood beside Sarah's hospital bed hours later, watching her eyelids flutter. She'd suffered a concussion. The blow had not been meant to kill, only to silence. "What was she doing there?" he asked aloud, not expecting an answer. "She was looking for proof," came Miss Marple's quiet reply. Leonard had hidden something, and someone else knew she'd found the clue. Who? Miss Marple tilted her head. Someone with access, someone with control over the centre, someone who keeps their house and their conscience immaculate. Crail's brow furrowed. Elaine? She's protective, but she's not clever enough to orchestrate this level of containment. You think it was Marchmont? Miss Marple didn't reply. She simply turned and walked toward the exit. At the threshold, she said, "There's a ledger, hidden behind the hymnals, but it's no longer there." Crail stared after her, and somewhere in the village, someone was burning paper. The kind that didn't just hold numbers, but names. Chapter 7. The fire had been small, contained neatly in the Barrow's cast-iron garden incinerator, but smoke was smoke. And in a village like St. Mary Mead, even a quiet column rising above a hedge invited attention. Miss Marple noticed it on her morning walk. She paused near the edge of the Barrow property, glancing at the smudged scent of burnt paper still clinging to the hedgerow. From her vantage point, she saw Dr. Barrow, sleeves rolled, shoveling cold ashes into a sack. His movements were too practiced, not hurried, but not casual either. It was Elaine who met Miss Marple's eyes. She stood on the back step, arms crossed, her mouth drawn in a line. Miss Marple offered a polite wave and continued walking. She had seen enough. At the station, Inspector Crail dropped the charred scraps recovered by Constable Bell onto his desk. They were fragments only, most illegible. But a half-burnt page, preserved beneath a heavier ledger corner, revealed enough: unauthorized disbursement, Youth Outreach Fund, Marchmont initial approval, no secondary signature. Crail tapped his pen against the paper. Marchmont? Should we bring her in? Bell asked. Not yet. Crail's eyes narrowed. She's too clever to burn anything herself. This feels like delegation. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Elaine Barrow. I thought you might like some scones, she said pleasantly as Elaine opened the door. Elaine hesitated. That's kind. She led Miss Marple into the sitting room, accepting the wrapped bundle as though it were something delicate and potentially dangerous. Miss Marple settled into the armchair with quiet grace. Her eyes scanned the room, the thin layer of ash on the windowsill, the fire grate swept too clean. You must be exhausted, she said gently, with all the attention. Elaine gave a brittle smile. The village does love its gossip. Gossip, Miss Marple said, is rarely creative. It tends to bloom from roots of truth. Elaine sat, hands folded in her lap. You've come to ask something. You might as well. Miss Marple tilted her head. Did you know Leonard Leach had written a report about the Youth Outreach Fund? He was going to submit it to the council. He had found something rather serious. Elaine's fingers tightened. He said he'd ruin us. Us? My husband, me, our reputation. But he was bluffing. Surely you know he enjoyed the game. Miss Marple didn't flinch. I also know bluffing doesn't leave one with a cracked skull. Elaine stood, pacing now. You think I killed him? I think you have many reasons to stay silent, Miss Marple said gently. But so do others, Mrs. Marchmont for one, and Sarah Fletcher, though someone clearly tried to ensure she wouldn't speak. Elaine froze. You saw someone, Miss Marple said, voice calm, the night of the charity event. Elaine turned slowly. Her voice, when it came, was low. I saw Marchmont, outside the storage corridor, just after the crash. She said she was checking the inventory. I thought it odd, but I didn't question her. She always has an explanation. And the next day. Elaine looked down. She asked me to speak to Dr. Barrow, to encourage him not to challenge the account audit. She said it would only draw attention to Leonard's personal affairs, that he wouldn't survive public scrutiny. Miss Marple gave a soft breath. And you agreed? Elaine looked up. I didn't think she meant harm, until Alice vanished. Crail listened to all this with grim focus. She was always in the background, he murmured, organizing, filing, keeping receipts. Which means she controlled the records, Miss Marple said, and she knew how to erase them. But motive? Miss Marple's voice was calm. Power, not for its own sake, but to maintain her position. She doesn't like mess or scandal, and Leonard was about to cause both. Crail nodded. And Sarah? She was just another thread Marchmont needed to snip. He stood. Bring her in. Mrs. Marchmont did not resist the summons. She arrived at the station wearing her smartest coat, hair pinned, expression unreadable. Inside the interview room, Crail laid out the burned fragment, the reports, the testimonies. "You destroyed centre records," he said. "You lied about Sarah's whereabouts, and you had the means and opportunity to enter the storage room before Leonard's body was found." She folded her hands. "I did what I had to. For the centre, for this village. Leonard wanted to dismantle everything we'd built." Crail leaned forward. "So you silenced him?" Mrs. Marchmont looked at Miss Marple, standing silently near the wall. "You, of all people, should understand," she said. "Order must be kept." Miss Marple's eyes were gentle but firm. "Order built on fear is merely silence, dear. And silence, true silence, often grows loud in the end." Marchmont said nothing more. But her stillness was answer enough. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the soft ticking of the mantel clock her only company. Outside, the village resumed its rhythm. Sarah Fletcher had woken in hospital and would recover. Alice Renfrew had been found, disoriented, bruised, left in a ditch near Much Benham. Likely drugged, likely meant to disappear. Mrs. Marchmont had confessed, in her own cool way, to orchestrating both Leonard's murder and the cover-up. Not by her hands, but by manipulation. She'd pressed the weight where it would collapse, knowing others would do the rest. Crail had called it administrative murder. Miss Marple thought that very apt. She reached for her knitting. The world had a curious way of dressing cruelty in good intentions. But thread by thread, it always unravelled. Chapter 8. The confession, when it came, was as carefully arranged as Mrs. Marchmont's linen drawer. No dramatics, no raised voice, just a precise listing of what she had done, what she had advised others to do, and what she believed had to be done for the good of the village. Inspector Crail listened in silence, pen still, letting her arrange the truth like tea sets on a polished tray. "I didn't strike Leonard myself," she said, "but I made it possible. I told him the committee would vote against his report. I told Elaine he'd hinted about exposing personal indiscretions. And I told Sarah not to open the centre's locked cabinet until the documents were corrected. I never used the word destroy, but I made the need clear." "Why?" Crail asked simply. Mrs. Marchmont lifted her chin. "Because Leonard had grown erratic. He wasn't thinking of the long-term reputation of the centre, of how fragile trust is in small communities. He wanted to stir everything, pull at old mistakes." "You mean he uncovered theft?" She did not flinch. "Misappropriation, at worst. You knew about the forged ledgers?" She paused. "I knew enough, but by the time it came to light, there was no undoing it quietly, so I buried it." She folded her hands, elegant and cold. "If you charge me, I'll go quietly. But don't pretend Leonard was a hero." Miss Marple, sitting in the corner, spoke for the first time. "No, he wasn't a hero, but he didn't deserve to be silenced." Mrs. Marchmont's eyes flicked toward her. "And Sarah?" "She'll recover," Crail said. "But you should know, she kept a backup." Mrs. Marchmont's mask cracked just briefly. "Impossible." "Filed under hymnal donations," Crail said flatly. "It included every altered entry. And your handwriting." There was no reaction now, only stillness. As if she had prepared herself for the moment, the curtains finally fell. That evening, news spread through St. Mary Mead like slow-moving fog. Mrs. Marchmont had been arrested. Dr. Barrow was to face a formal inquiry. Elaine Barrow had resigned from the community centre committee, and the centre itself would close temporarily for restructuring. At the vicarage garden, Miss Marple joined Mrs. Bantry on a bench beneath the climbing roses. The air was unusually still. "So it was Marchmont all along," Mrs. Bantry said, frowning at her knitting. I always thought she was too sharp, but murder? Not by her hand, Miss Marple replied, but by her will. She manipulated them all. She provided just enough pressure. Elaine feared scandal. Sarah feared her job. Leonard was clever, but careless with people's loyalties, and Marchmont understood everyone's cracks. Mrs. Bantry sighed. The village won't be the same. No, Miss Marple agreed. But then villages never are after someone's been buried. A silence passed between them. Then Miss Marple added softly, But I don't think this is quite over. Mrs. Bantry looked up. You mean the investigation? I mean the truth. Indeed, it wasn't over. Because 2 days later, as Inspector Crail reviewed final interviews, he received a note. No return address, no signature. It contained only one line. Marchmont was covering for someone else. He read it twice, then again. He walked to the evidence locker, opened the file marked Youth Outreach Misconduct, and flipped through the records. One entry caught his eye, signed by someone not previously suspected. A signature that had appeared on a transfer Leonard Leach had challenged. A signature forged once, then used again, not Marchmont's, not Elaine's, not even Barrow's. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned from her walk to find Inspector Crail waiting on her garden path. You were right, he said. It's not finished. Oh? She brushed a fleck of leaf from her sleeve. Do come in. Inside, over tea, Crail laid it out. The forged ledgers pointed us to Marchmont, but the real theft, the first unauthorized transfer, was signed in the name of someone who had no financial clearance, someone who didn't work on the books at all. Sarah, Miss Marple asked quietly. Crail nodded. We thought she was used, but it's possible she used them all. Miss Marple was quiet. Then she was always pale when mentioned in passing, but never once asked who had been blamed. She's clever, Crail said, made herself look like a frightened subordinate, hid behind other people's guilt, and now she's disappeared. Miss Marple looked out the window, where crows shifted across the rooftops. People often assume the most frightened-looking person is the most innocent, but fear is sometimes a mask for calculation. Crail stood. If you were me, where would you look? Miss Marple smiled faintly. At the place she was most invisible. The one job no one watched closely. Marchmont's house? No, Miss Marple said. The church registry. Sarah volunteered there before she worked for the centre. If she changed her name, or slipped something into records, it would be there. Crail narrowed his eyes. And if we find her? Miss Marple folded her hands. Then this time the story ends properly. Because Sarah Fletcher, quiet, soft-spoken, unremarkable Sarah, had likely been the first to forge the books, perhaps to cover a debt, perhaps to help someone else. But the moment Leonard noticed, she had set the pieces in motion. Marchmont had tried to contain the damage. Elaine had protected her reputation. But Sarah had orchestrated the real beginning and perhaps the end. Miss Marple's eyes returned to the garden gate. The truth had always been a layered thing, and just when it seemed all had been uncovered, one more petal would fall. Chapter 9. The church records were kept in a narrow cabinet tucked inside the vestry at St. Aldhelm's, behind the choir loft, where only the vicar and his secretary ever seemed to venture. It smelled of wax linen and old books, of things rarely disturbed. Inspector Crail turned each page carefully, assisted by the vicar himself, who seemed both curious and concerned. These aren't the sort of books I imagined you'd be interested in, Inspector, the Reverend said, folding his hands nervously. I'm looking for volunteer logs, Crail replied, names, dates, and access. And you think young Sarah? Crail didn't answer directly. He pointed to an entry on the 3rd page. Fletcher, S. Volunteer Scribe, Church Records and Donation Letters, January-June. And the handwriting? He asked. The vicar adjusted his glasses and nodded. Meticulous, never missed a name. Crail flipped to the donation logs. There it was, Sarah Fletcher, penned in the same elegant hand as the Outreach Fund ledger entries now stored in the police evidence room. Same looped F, same descending stroke on the lowercase t. She forged the first disbursement, Crail muttered. She was inside long before anyone realized. And now she was gone. Across the village, Miss Marple sat at her desk beneath the lace-draped window, making a list, not of suspects this time, but of locations. Sarah Fletcher had grown up in St. Mary Mead, worked in it, lived in it. Yet, in the past 24 hours, she had become a ghost. It was not like the impulsive flight of guilt. It was something more deliberate. Sarah had always been quiet, but quietness, Miss Marple knew, could be armour. She rose, retrieved her coat and hat, and walked to the high street. At the corner shop, she asked Mr. Rowe a simple question. Has anyone purchased an outbound train ticket in the last day? For a young woman, late 20s, fair-haired, Mr. Rowe thought. No one that fits Miss Marple. But yesterday, someone came asking for a money order to be held under the name F. Sutherland. Said it was a pickup. Miss Marple blinked. That's not Sarah Fletcher's name. No, said Mr. Rowe, but I remember her face. Polite, pale, paid in cash. Marple smiled faintly. Thank you, Mr. Rowe. That was very helpful. She left, already connecting the pieces. Sarah had forged names before. Why not her own? Inspector Crail knocked on Elaine Barrow's door shortly after noon. She answered, visibly worn, her hair loose for the first time since Leonard's death. I've already told you everything I know, she said, not unkindly. I think you've told me everything you believed was safe, Crail said, but not what you suspect. Elaine hesitated, then stepped aside. In the sitting room, Crail pulled the forged ledger copy from his coat. We matched this to Sarah's church records. She's the one who signed the initial transfer. Not Marchmont, not even you. Elaine sat down slowly. I didn't know. You must have suspected. She was always eager, efficient, and she needed money quietly, I assumed it was, for her brother. He's ill, you know. But when Leonard found the discrepancy and told me, I begged him to hold off. But Marchmont acted first, Crail finished. Elaine nodded. She saw the risk, to the centre, to our reputations. She thought she could clean it quietly. And Sarah? Elaine's voice dropped. She disappeared that morning, after Sarah visited the centre on her own, without permission. I think she took what remained. Files, money, names. She covered her trail like she'd planned it. Crail leaned forward. Why not tell me all this sooner? Elaine looked him in the eye. Because part of me still wanted to protect her. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had walked down to the old railway siding, the place young people gathered when they wanted to be invisible for a while. The last freight train left hours ago, but a bench remained near the tracks, half hidden by wild hedges. And there, sitting very still, was Sarah Fletcher. Her coat was neatly buttoned, her suitcase beside her. She stared ahead at nothing in particular, posture perfectly composed. I thought you'd come, she said without turning. Miss Marple sat beside her. It's always the tidy ones, she said softly, who think they can file away guilt like an old tax record. Sarah's throat bobbed, but she didn't speak. You made one mistake, Miss Marple continued. You assumed people wouldn't notice a person like you disappearing, but you underestimated how few people can disappear in a village. Sarah finally looked at her. "I never meant for Leonard to die." "I believe you. I only took what I thought wouldn't be missed. Then, when he started asking questions, I panicked, told Mrs. Marchmont. I didn't know what she'd do. I didn't know she'd tell Elaine. I thought they'd just discredit him." "But they discredited themselves," Miss Marple said. "And now you're here." Sarah looked down. "I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't go back." Miss Marple reached into her bag and pulled out a small folded note. It was from Leonard, recovered from a box at the centre. Unfinished, scrawled in haste. "Sarah took the first funds, but she's not cruel, just desperate. Please don't ruin her." Sarah read it in silence. Then, for the first time in days, she cried, and Miss Marple let her. Not as punishment, but as permission, because the truth, once named, never goes quietly. Chapter 10. By the next morning, the village of St. Mary Mead wore a strange expression, like someone who had just awoken from a bad dream but wasn't entirely certain it had ended. The community centre remained locked, its windows shuttered. The Barrows had stopped appearing in public altogether. And Mrs. Marchmont's name was spoken with an odd mix of disbelief and relief. Only Miss Marple's pace remained unchanged, her steps quiet, measured, and somehow one step ahead. Sarah Fletcher had turned herself in. She arrived at the police station just before breakfast. Escorted by Miss Marple, who declined to enter the building with her, but lingered outside with a book in hand until the station doors closed behind them. Inside, Sarah sat across from Inspector Crail with the weary acceptance of someone who had finally stopped running. "I forged the transfer," she said. "I'd intended to return the money before the audit, but Leonard caught it first." Crail didn't interrupt. "He confronted me in confidence. He wasn't cruel. But I panicked, told Mrs. Marchmont. I thought she'd manage it quietly. Instead, she called Elaine, and after that, you disappeared." Sarah nodded. "I thought if I stayed quiet, it would go away." "It nearly did," Crail replied. "But Miss Marple never lets things vanish so easily." Sarah's voice cracked. "I never wanted anyone hurt." "You may not have lifted the shelf," Crail said, "but your silence placed the weight." He leaned back. "Do you have anything else to add?" She hesitated, then opened her coat and pulled out a folder, creased but intact. "The last of Leonard's notes. He gave them to me days before the event. I never read them. I was too afraid." Crail opened it. Inside, handwritten annotations, receipts, a personal memo titled, "If Anything Happens to Me." Later that day, Crail stood beside Miss Marple beneath the yew trees near the church, the air thick with mist and unspoken thoughts. "She's telling the truth," Crail said. "Leonard wanted her to come clean, but not to suffer. He thought Marchmont would scare her, not ruin her." Miss Marple nodded, glancing toward the memorial stones. "That's the trouble with clever people. They believe others will stop before the point of no return. But desperation has no brakes." "And Marchmont?" "Had grown used to cleaning up the village," Miss Marple said softly. "Eventually, she thought she could erase the truth itself." Crail exhaled. "It's over then." "No," Miss Marple said. "Now it can end." He turned to her. "What's the difference?" She smiled faintly. "Ending isn't silence, it's understanding." The next Sunday, the community centre held a brief, subdued meeting. Not an event, not a fundraiser, just a gathering. Chairs arranged in a circle. Tea poured without ceremony. No one dressed up. Miss Cavendish brought a simple bouquet and placed it on the empty chair where Leonard Leach would have sat. No speeches were given. But after a long pause, Mrs. Bantry stood. "He wasn't always easy," she said, "but he tried to do right." Others nodded, even the vicar. Elaine Barrow arrived halfway through. She sat at the back. She said nothing, but she stayed. And Sarah's name, though not spoken, floated there too, like a ghost made visible and forgiven. 2 days later, Miss Marple was asked to visit the centre again, this time to review the ledgers herself, as part of the newly appointed Oversight Committee. She declined the invitation. But she did stop by for tea. She stood for a moment in the corridor where Leonard had died. The shelving was gone now, the carpet replaced. A vase of flowers stood near the window, pale yellow chrysanthemums. She stepped into the small side office. There, tucked inside the drawer beneath the file cabinet, was a slip of paper someone had missed. She unfolded it gently. Mistakes must be seen to be mended, not buried. Otherwise, they bloom into worse things. LL. She folded it again, slipped it into her handbag. As she left, she passed the hall where children's art now hung on the wall, crayon drawings bright and clumsy and honest. In one, a figure stood with a clipboard, smiling beside a tree and a dog. Miss Marple smiled. Leonard had been drawn slightly out of proportion, but the likeness was unmistakable. Sometimes it seemed the village remembered better than it realized. That evening, as rain tapped gently at the window panes, Miss Marple sat beside the hearth, her needles moving slowly through a ball of sea-green yarn. Outside, peace had returned to St. Mary Mead, but not the sort of peace born of ignorance. Rather the kind earned after disruption. The kind where truths, however small, however uncomfortable, had been laid bare. In the end, Leonard Leach's death had exposed not one villain, but several small cruelties stitched into the village fabric. The fear of disgrace, the obsession with order, the temptation to protect one's name rather than one's neighbour. But those cruelties had not prevailed. And as Miss Marple paused to count her stitches, she thought of a young woman choosing to stop running, of a man who had written, just in case, and of how justice sometimes comes not from judgment, but from clarity. Chapter 11. The next week passed with a gentleness that felt almost suspicious. No new arrests, no whispered revelations, just a quiet, persistent return to routine in St. Mary Mead. The village had slipped back into its usual rhythm. Mornings at the bakery, afternoons tending gardens, evenings filled with knitting needles and kettle whistles. But Miss Marple had long known that quiet was not always peace. At the post office, she noted Mr. Taylor's hesitant glances when handling official letters from the council. At the grocer's, Mrs. Cardew avoided eye contact with Elaine Barrow. Even the vicar had stumbled slightly over his sermon, forgetting a familiar line of scripture. The village was breathing again, but unevenly. And something, Miss Marple felt, had yet to settle. One thread still tugged at her thoughts. She sat by the window that afternoon, the light soft and golden on her carpet, reviewing the case not from its end, but from its beginning. Leonard's death had triggered a cascade. Sarah's disappearance, Marchmont's fall, Elaine's reckoning. But not everything that came after had been born from the murder itself. Some events had been waiting, dormant. She reached into her bureau drawer and pulled out Leonard's final note, the one found in Sarah's coat pocket. Sarah took the first funds, but she's not cruel, just desperate. Please don't ruin her. But the writing was odd, slanted, rushed, but inconsistent. Miss Marple knew Leonard's hand, and one letter had always caught her eye in his scrawls, his peculiar lowercase a, which curved backward like a fishhook. This note didn't have it. She studied the ink, then reached for another slip, the one she'd found behind the hymnal cabinet weeks ago. That did have the hooked E. She frowned. 2 notes, both attributed to Leonard, but only one in his actual handwriting. She rang Inspector Crail before the tea cooled. "Are you suggesting someone forged Leonard's final words?" Crail asked, brows drawn. "I'm suggesting someone tried to rewrite the end," Miss Marple replied, "to soften Sarah's image, perhaps even to paint her as merely frightened, a closing act of protection." Crail was silent for a beat. "You think Sarah forged it?" "No, I think someone else did. Someone who didn't know Leonard's hand as well as they thought." Crail leaned back. "Then who?" Miss Marple's eyes were quiet. The person who had the most to gain if Sarah appeared merely weak, not calculating. Crail blinked. "Elaine?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "She turned herself in willingly, didn't she? Cooperated, resigned from the centre board, played the part of the shamed accomplice. But she also controlled the narrative." Crail stared at her. "You think she wrote that note and planted it on Sarah?" "I think she found Leonard's real last entry and hid it. Then penned a new one, to shield herself, because the original didn't absolve her. It implicated her more directly." Crail said nothing, but 20 minutes later he was back at the Barrow residence with a search warrant. The search revealed very little. Elaine had been thorough. But beneath a stack of old church event programs in her sewing desk, Crail found it. A notebook, half filled with financial figures and tightly scrawled thoughts. A journal of sorts. One page near the middle was dog-eared. The handwriting was Leonard's. It read, "E.B. urged me to delay report again, said she'd handle Sarah, said Marchmont would step in if needed. Don't like the sound of that. Too many hands in this now. If anything happens to me, start with Elaine." Crail closed the book with a sigh. It had always been there, only buried, not lost. Elaine was brought in quietly. At first, she denied everything. Then, calmly, she admitted to forging Leonard's final note. "I didn't kill him," she repeated. "I didn't even ask anyone to." "But you lied," Crail said. "You manipulated the aftermath. You protected Sarah just long enough to deflect your own role. And you concealed his final words." Elaine straightened. "Because I thought it would be better for everyone. For the centre. For the village." Miss Marple's voice cut gently through the room. "But justice isn't about what's better. It is about what's true." Elaine's shoulders fell. This time she said nothing. The following Sunday the church held a brief memorial, not for Leonard Leach alone, but for all that had been lost. Trust, transparency, the illusion that small towns were immune to quiet treacheries. Miss Marple sat in the second row, her gloved hands folded neatly. As the vicar read from the Psalms, her eyes moved not to the pulpit, but to the people. Mrs. Bantry dabbing her eyes, the Barrows absent, Mr. Eversley rigid and pale, and Sarah. Sarah sat in the back pew. She had been released on probation, the charges against her reduced in light of the true sequence of events. But her future in St. Mary Mead was uncertain. She stood as the service ended, and for the first time she met Miss Marple's gaze with no mask between them. No fear, no pretence, only a nod, not of gratitude, but of acknowledgement. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and poured herself a cup of chamomile tea. She unwrapped a small parcel sent from the council office, a thank you of sorts. Inside was a new ledger, blank, gold-edged. She smiled. "Let's hope this one stays clean," she murmured. And as the fire crackled, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. Another case closed, another quiet restored. But she knew, as always, peace was not the absence of wrongdoing. It was the willingness to see it, even in the most familiar places. Chapter 12. the village of St. Mary Mead settled once more. The community centre reopened under new oversight. A fresh coat of paint disguised the stains of its past, but the echoes lingered, quiet reminders that no amount of varnish could smooth over human fault. The new committee had 3 rules, written in large clear lettering and posted at the entrance. All financial records must be cross-verified. No single person shall hold access to all accounts. If something seems wrong, speak. They were simple rules, born from hard lessons. Sarah Fletcher did not return to work at the centre. Instead, she left the village 3 weeks after her probation was finalised, boarding a northbound train with no fanfare. Her departure was early, before sunrise. Only the vicar saw her off, pressing a brown parcel into her hands, a book of parables and a note from Miss Marple that read simply, "The truth, when owned, loses its weight." No one in the village spoke cruelly of her afterward. But they didn't speak often either. Forgiveness came slowly, and some things, once broken, never returned to what they were. Elaine Barrow and her husband quietly sold the laurels and moved to Sussex. Her involvement in the cover-up, though non-violent, had been decisive, and the shame that followed clung to her like ivy. It was not criminal guilt that chased her from the village, but the soft, unrelenting disapproval of those who once respected her. Dr. Barrow himself was cleared of direct wrongdoing, but his reputation suffered. He closed his practice not long after. Mrs. Marchmont faced a formal inquiry, charged not with murder, but with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Her sentence was suspended, but she was never again seen at a church function, never again asked to organise a fete or fundraiser. Her name, once spoken with admiration, had become shorthand for quiet tyranny. And Leonard Leach, whose death had exposed them all, was remembered with unexpected warmth. It turned out that the villagers, once sceptical of his abrupt manners and clipboard obsessions, missed him more than they admitted. He had asked questions no one wanted asked, but he had asked them for the right reasons. At the annual spring fair, a bench was installed beneath the elder tree near the community centre garden, with a small plaque that read, "To Leonard Leach, who kept the books open." Miss Marple stood before it one quiet morning, gloved hands folded neatly in front of her. Inspector Crail joined her. "So," he said softly, "it's all finished." She tilted her head. "The case is closed, but the village, it remembers." He looked at her, puzzled. "Is that a good thing?" Her reply was gentle. "It depends on what we choose to remember." He nodded. "And what do you remember?" She glanced down at the plaque. "That one man died not because he lied, but because others did. That justice can be quiet, and that fear, left unspoken, becomes very loud." Crail was silent for a moment. Then he asked, "Do you regret pushing, digging?" Miss Marple smiled, warmly but with a trace of weariness. "I never dig, Inspector. I listen. People tell you what you need to know. Eventually." They stood for a while longer, watching the breeze stir the new shoots in the garden. The centre behind them hummed with activity again. Children's voices, the clatter of chairs, the rustle of paper. Life, resilient as ever. Crail turned to leave, but paused. "You know, you were right from the beginning. It wasn't about the murder. It was about the silence." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes gleamed. That evening, the vicar hosted a simple tea at the parish hall. A dozen villagers came, some out of habit, some out of hope for something warmer than memory. There were scones and seed cake. No music, no speeches, just fellowship. Mrs. Bantry brought preserves. Mr. Eversley read a poem, awkwardly but earnestly. Miss Cavendish distributed bookmarks with quotes about honesty and courage, which most politely tucked away. Miss Marple, of course, sat in the corner chair beside the radiator, her knitting needles clicking with soft precision. And as the evening wound down, the vicar raised his cup. To those who see clearly, even when others look, away, a pause, then glasses lifted. No one said Leonard's name, but they didn't need to. Back at home, Miss Marple placed her knitting aside and opened a small envelope she had been saving. It was Leonard's real note, the one not shared publicly, the one not burned nor rewritten. She read it once more. If anything happens to me, don't trust the neat explanations. They're often the ones that hide the most. She folded it, returned it to her drawer. Not because it was hidden, but because it had been seen fully. She turned off the lamp, stepped into the kitchen, made one final cup of tea before bed. In the dark, St. Mary Mead rested again, not because its secrets were gone, but because they had been aired. And truth, like tea, must steep before it reveals its full strength.